The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the park as Nia Carter strolled leisurely with Max at her side. Max's tail wagged enthusiastically, his leash loose in her hand, as they meandered along the winding path. The familiar scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the distant sound of children's laughter, creating a tranquil ambiance. For a brief moment, everything felt right. This walk was their daily tradition, a cherished time to unwind and let go of looming deadlines and mounting responsibilities. Nia smiled softly as Max stopped to investigate a cluster of flowers, his nose twitching with curiosity. "Come on, buddy," she coaxed, gently tugging on the leash. "Let's finish the loop before dinner." Max gave a short, cheerful bark, his ears perking up as if to agree. Just ahead, a figure loitered near a bench, his posture slouched and his gaze sharp. Nia's hand instinctively tightened on Max's leash. The man, appearing to be in his late 20s, wore a stained hoodie and scuffed boots, his expression cold and uninviting. As Nia approached, his eyes locked onto her, his lips curling into a mocking sneer. "Out for a stroll, huh?" he muttered, his tone dripping with scorn, his gaze briefly shifting to Max. "Fancy dog for someone like you." Nia hesitated, her stomach twisting with unease, but she kept her voice steady. "Just getting some fresh air," she replied, attempting to move past him. The man scoffed, but continued to glare at her, his presence lingering like a shadow. "Fresh air? Yeah, sure. Walk your dog like nothing happened." His words were laden with bitterness. Nia frowned, her confusion growing, but her caution unwavering. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said cautiously. "You people think you can do whatever you want," he spat, his voice rising with anger. "Walk through my neighborhood like you own it. Last month, I got evicted because of your kind moving in and jacking up the rents. Now I'm stuck here, and you're out here flaunting it." She froze, her grip tightening on Max's leash. "I don't know anything about that, but I had nothing to do with it." "Don't play dumb," he snapped, his tone sharp and accusing. "You're all the same. Move in, push us out, and then act like it doesn't matter. Think you're better than me, huh?" He stepped closer, his body language becoming more threatening. Nia's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "Look," she said firmly, "I don't want any trouble. I'm just walking my dog." The man let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and dismissive. "Trouble? You're the one bringing trouble. You don't even belong here." His gaze dropped to Max, who growled softly, his ears flattening. "And this mutt? Acting all tough, just like his owner." "Let's go, Max," Nia said, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her as she tried to steer Max away. But the man stepped in front of them, blocking their path. "You think you can just walk away?" he growled, his voice growing harsher, his face twisted with anger. "Maybe it's time someone reminded you that this isn't your park." His gaze flickered to Max again, his expression darkening. "And I know just how to start." It's..." Nia's breath caught as the man shifted his weight, stepping closer. Max growled louder, his body tense and protective. The man's sneer deepened as he muttered, "You've got something I need. People like me don't get second chances. You take everything. Jobs, housing, respect. I'm done losing." "I don't have anything to do with that," Nia said, her voice steady, but her nerves fraying. "Just let us go." "Oh, you'll give me something," he replied coldly, pointing a finger at her. "How about that wallet in your pocket?" His gaze fell back on Max, and a sinister grin spread across his face. "Or maybe the mutt gets it instead." Nia's heart raced, her fingers tightening around Max's leash. "Don't you dare touch him," she said, her voice sharp and resolute. The man laughed mockingly, his tone full of disdain. "What's the plan, lady? You gonna fight me over a dog? Let's see if you care more about your cash or that mutt." Max barked sharply, the sound echoing through the park. A jogger in the distance paused briefly before continuing, but the man paid no attention. His focus was locked on Nia. "I don't have any money on me," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm. "And I'm not giving you anything." "Is that so?" he said, his tone darkening further. "Then maybe I'll just take what I want." Before she could respond, the man lunged forward. Nia instinctively stepped back, positioning herself between him and Max. With a surge of adrenaline, she shoved him away, her voice rising in anger. "Back off!" Max barked again, baring his teeth as he strained against the leash. The man staggered but quickly regained his footing, his face twisting in fury. "You think you're tough? I'll show you tough." He reached for Max's leash, but Nia yanked it away just in time. Her instincts took over. "Come on, Max!" she shouted, her voice breaking with urgency as she turned and bolted down the path. Max ran alongside her, limping slightly but determined to keep up. Behind them, the man's voice roared in anger. "You can't outrun me. You hear me? You're not getting away." The sound of his pounding footsteps echoed behind them, growing louder as he chased them down the winding path. Beside her, Max's gait was uneven but resolute, each step a testament to his unwavering loyalty. Nia's breaths came in short, sharp gasps, her heart pounding in tandem with her racing thoughts. She cast a quick glance over her shoulder, catching sight of Jared charging after them, his face a mask of fury. "You can't run forever!" Jared's shout cut through the air like a jagged knife, his voice brimming with venom. Nia's hands trembled as she struggled to unlock her phone, her thumb swiping frantically at the screen. Come on," she muttered under her breath, her pace barely faltering as her eyes darted between the pathway ahead and the device in her hand. At last, she managed to dial 911, pressing the phone against her ear while forcing her legs to keep moving. A calm, detached voice came through the line, starkly contrasting the chaos surrounding her. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" "There's a man chasing me," Nia panted, her words spilling out in a frantic rush. "He attacked me and my dog. He's trying to hurt us." "Ma'am, are you in a safe location?" the operator asked evenly. "No, I'm running through the park," Nia replied, her voice trembling. "He's right behind me. Please send someone now." "Stay on the line with me," the operator instructed. "Can you describe the man?" Nia glanced over her shoulder again, dread clawing at her as she saw Jared narrowing the distance between them. His face was flushed with rage, his teeth bared in a menacing snarl. "White male, late 20s, she gasped. "Hoodie, jeans, brown hair. He's chasing us. Officers are on their way. Keep moving if you can, and try to stay in well-lit areas." Her grip tightened on Max's leash as she veered toward a busier path, clinging to the hope of encountering someone who might intervene. Yet, with each passing second, the park seemed to grow eerily empty, as though the universe had conspired to abandon her in this harrowing moment. "Hey!" Jared's voice rang louder and closer, a chilling reminder of his presence. "You think the cops will save you? They won't do a damn thing." His taunts sent fresh waves of fear coursing through her, but Nia refused to stop. She glanced back once more, her stomach twisting at the sight of his contorted expression. It was his fury that pushed her legs to move faster. "Please, hurry!" she pleaded into the phone. "He's getting closer." Her muscles burned, her lungs screamed for relief, but she didn't dare slow her pace. Max stumbled slightly, letting out a soft whimper, and Nia's heart ached at the sound. "Almost there, Max," she whispered, though she had no idea where there even was. Nia's feet pounded against the pavement as her lungs seared with exertion. Max, despite his evident struggle, kept pace, his loyalty driving him forward. Every instinct screamed at her to put as much distance as possible between them and the madman chasing them. Yet Jared's pounding footsteps grew louder, his voice slicing through the park's eerie quiet. "You think you can get away from me?" Jared roared, his voice echoing ominously. "You can't hide, and no one's coming to save you." Dread welled up in Nia as she glanced over her shoulder again. Jared was closing the gap, his stride long and purposeful, his rage palpable. Her fingers fumbled with the phone, the operator's voice still a faint reassurance in her ear. "Ma'am, stay on the line," the operator said, her tone steady and unyielding. "Officers are en route." "He's catching up," Nia panted, her words quick and breathless. "Tell them to hurry." "Officers have been dispatched to your location," the operator reassured her. "Stay as calm as you can." The word calm felt hollow, almost absurd. Nia's desperation mounted as Jared's snarling form drew closer. Max let out another strained bark, his limp worsening with each step. Her heart twisted at the sight of him struggling, his usual vigor dimmed by exhaustion and pain. Jared lunged forward, and instinct took over. Nia spun around, yanking Max's leash to pull him behind her. Planting her feet firmly, she stood her ground, her chest heaving with exertion as she faced her pursuer. The malice in Jared's eyes chilled her to the core, but she refused to back down. Max growled low, his teeth bared as he pressed against her leg, a small but fierce protector. "You really thought you could outrun me?" Jared sneered, halting just a few feet away. His chest heaved, but his voice retained its cruel arrogance. "Look at you. Pathetic. You should have just handed over the wallet. Now you're making this harder for yourself." "I don't have anything for you," Nia shot back, her voice trembling but defiant. "Leave us alone. The police are coming." Jared laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made her stomach churn. "The police?" He gestured to the deserted path around them. "Where are they? Do you see anyone coming to save you? It's just you, me, and that useless mutt." Max barked sharply, his growl deepening as he stepped in front of Nia. Jared's sneer twisted further as he pointed at the dog. "That thing? You really think it's going to protect you? One good kick, and it's done." "Don't you dare touch him!" Nia snapped, her voice rising in anger as her fists clenched tightly. The leash bit into her palm, but she barely noticed. "You've done enough." Jared took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Oh, I'm just getting started. You think you can walk around here like you own the place? People like you think you can take whatever you want, but not today. Stay back," Nia warned, her voice firm despite the tremble in her body. She knew running was no longer an option. Jared wasn't going to stop, and she wouldn't let him harm Max or her again. Jared smirked, taking another menacing step forward. "What are you going to do, huh? Swing that leash at me? Scream for help? Go ahead. Let's see who's really in charge here." Max's bark rang out again, louder and fiercer, the sound reverberating through the still air. Jared flinched slightly. Jared faltered for a brief moment, his bravado flickering like a dying ember, but the sneer quickly returned. His hands clenched into fists, his body taut and ready for confrontation. Nia's breathing steadied as she braced herself, her mind racing through the possibilities. One thing was certain. She wasn't backing down, not this time. The tension between them felt electric, charged with unspoken threats and determination. They stood locked in a silent standoff, with only Max's low, unrelenting growls breaking the heavy stillness. Jared's smirk widened as he took a single step closer, his eyes darting between Nia and the dog. The pressure was suffocating, and Nia's heart thundered in her chest as if trying to escape. Her grip on Max's leash tightened, her voice trembling but resolute as she said, "Don't do this. Just walk away." Jared scoffed, his expression hardening into something cruel. "Walk away? No chance. You're going to give me what I want. Hand over that wallet, or I'll make sure your little mutt never walks again." Nia's gaze dropped to Max, who stood firm at her side despite the obvious pain in his limp. His growls deepened, his small body vibrating with protective resolve. Her thoughts spiraled. Maybe giving up her wallet would end this. Maybe it would keep Max safe. With shaky hands, she reached into her jacket pocket, pulling out her wallet. "Take it," she said, her voice strained. "Just leave us alone." Jared snatched the wallet from her outstretched hand, his movements rough and triumphant. He flipped it open, rifling through its contents with a sneer that deepened as he pulled out the few bills she had inside. "This is it? Pathetic," he spat, tossing the empty wallet to the ground. Then, with a menacing step forward, his eyes gleamed with malice. "Maybe I'll teach you a lesson anyway." It was at that moment that Max sprang into action. With surprising speed, he lunged at Jared, his teeth flashing as he bit into the man's jeans. Jared stumbled backward, cursing loudly as the dog's jaws held firm. "Get this stupid dog off me!" Jared yelled, shaking his leg violently in an attempt to break free. "Max, no!" Nia cried, her voice trembling with panic. She pulled on the leash, trying to coax Max into releasing his grip. But Max, loyal and unyielding, refused to back down, his growls feral and fierce. Jared's rage boiled over. In one brutal motion, he raised his boot and kicked Max hard in the side. The dog let out a piercing yelp of pain, his small body crumpling as he hit the ground. "That's what you get," Jared sneered, his face twisted with fury. "Max!" Nia screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands trembled as she cradled his trembling body, tears streaming uncontrollably down her face. "It's okay, buddy. Stay with me," she whispered, her voice cracking. Jared loomed over her, his chest heaving as if preparing to lash out again. But before he could make another move, the distant wail of sirens pierced the tense silence. His expression shifted, a flicker of panic crossing his face as he scanned the deserted park. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Without another word, he turned and bolted, disappearing into the shadowy tree line. Nia didn't move. Her entire focus was on Max, whose eyes remained open but dulled with pain. She whispered softly to him, her tears soaking into his golden fur. "You're going to be okay, Max. I promise." The sound of approaching sirens grew louder, a bitter-sweet relief washing over her as help finally arrived. Kneeling on the hard pavement, her hands hovered over Max's fragile form. The warmth of his fur beneath her fingertips was a stark reminder of the brutal reality she now faced. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each shallow breath tugging at her heart. Tears spilled from her eyes as she grappled with the enormity of the moment. "Max!" she choked out, her voice trembling as she stroked his head. His soft ears twitched faintly, a small but precious sign of life. "Stay with me, boy. Please, you're my brave boy." Her words wavered as she cupped his face, trying to hold back the tide of her own panic. "You're the strongest dog I know," she whispered, her lips quivering into a shaky smile through the tears. "Remember when you tore up that chew toy in 2 minutes flat? I had to buy the indestructible ones because nothing could hold up to you." Max's ears flicked faintly at her voice, and she clung to that tiny response as if it were a lifeline. "You're not done being strong, okay?" she continued, her tone soft but resolute. "You're not leaving me. Not today. We still have so much to do, so many walks to take, so many squirrels to chase." Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and with trembling hands she fumbled to pull it out. The screen blurred through her tears, but she managed to redial 911. Her breath hitched as the operator's voice returned, a fragile thread of hope in the chaos. "911. What's your emergency?" "It's my dog," Nia stammered, her voice raw with emotion. "He's been hurt. He needs help. Please. He's not moving right. I don't know what to do." The operator's voice was calm, steady, and grounding. "Officers are arriving now, and animal services are on their way. Stay with your dog and keep him calm. Help is on the way." "Thank you," Nia whispered, her voice barely audible. Her focus returned to Max as she gently stroked his back, her tears dripping onto his fur. He let out a faint whimper, his body trembling as he tried to shift closer to her. "It's okay," she murmured, pressing her forehead to his. "It's okay, buddy. You just have to hold on a little longer. They're coming to help you. I promise." She whispered to him, her words a soothing mantra of love and encouragement. "You're my protector, Max. Remember that." "Right?" Max's tail twitched faintly, a small, fragile movement against the cold ground, but it was enough to make Nia's breath hitch in her chest. "There you are," she murmured, a tearful smile breaking through her despair. "That's my boy. You're so brave, braver than me." Her fingers gently stroked his fur, her voice wavering but full of warmth. The distant wail of sirens cut through the stillness of the park, growing louder with each passing second. Nia's head lifted as the flashing red and blue lights pierced the surrounding darkness, their glow creating an otherworldly scene. Relief washed over her, but it did little to ease the ache deep in her heart. "See, Max?" she whispered softly, leaning closer to her loyal companion. "They're here. They're going to take care of you. I won't let anything happen to you, I promise." A police cruiser rolled onto the gravel path, its tires crunching loudly in the otherwise silent park. Behind it, an animal services van came into view, its bold logo illuminated by the swirling lights. Nia waved them over with one hand while the other stayed firmly on Max, her connection to him grounding her amidst the chaos. "We're going to get through this," she said, her voice steadier now, a quiet but fierce determination threading through her words. "You and me, Max, just like always." As an officer stepped out of the patrol car, his face reflected both urgency and concern. He approached swiftly, followed closely by a vet technician emerging from the van. Nia's gaze shifted between Max and the approaching help, her tears subsiding as she allowed resolve to take hold. This wasn't the end. Not for Max, not for her, and certainly not for the man who had caused this pain. Justice would come, but for now, Max was her only focus. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" the officer asked, his tone calm but urgent as he assessed the scene. Nia quickly shook her head, though her voice trembled as she spoke. "Not me. It's Max, my dog. He's in so much pain. He can't even move properly." Her voice broke as she gestured toward Max's still form. The officer crouched beside her, his expression softening as he took in the situation. "We'll get him the help he needs," he reassured her, pulling out his radio. "Animal Services is right here. They'll take care of him. You mentioned someone attacked you. Did they harm you at all?" "No," Nia replied quickly, her voice rising slightly as she recounted the events. "He didn't touch me. But Max, he wouldn't stop kicking him. He was so angry. And Max," her voice cracked as the memory overwhelmed her. The officer's face hardened with resolve as he processed her words. "Did you get a good look at the man? Can you describe him?" "Yes," she answered, her tone sharpening as her determination returned. "He was white, mid-20s, with brown hair. He wore a gray hoodie and scuffed jeans, and he said he'd hurt Max unless I gave him my wallet. When Max tried to protect me, he kicked him so hard." Her voice faltered, and she buried her face in her hands, fighting to steady her breath. The officer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did everything you could," he said softly. "And you're here for him now. That's what matters." Behind them, the van's doors slammed shut, and a vet technician hurried over with a stretcher. Nia moved aside, her hands trembling as she gestured toward Max. "Please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please help him. He's everything to me." The vet technician knelt beside Max, her movements gentle but efficient as she examined his injuries. "He's a fighter," she said with a small, encouraging smile. "We'll take good care of him." "Thank you," Nia whispered, her hands pressed to her chest, as she watched them lift Max carefully onto the stretcher. His tail flicked faintly once more, and fresh tears welled in her eyes at the small sign of life. The officer stood as the technician carried Max to the van, then turned back to Nia. "We'll put out a description of the suspect and start searching for him immediately," he said. "Do you want to file a report now, or would you prefer to wait?" Nia's jaw tightened as she wiped away her tears. "No," she said firmly. "I'll do it now. That man isn't getting away with this." The officer nodded, pulling out his notepad. "All right, let's start at the beginning. You said he approached you in the park. What exactly did he say?" Nia drew a shaky breath, her eyes flicking toward the van where Max was being secured. "He was angry," she began, her voice steadier now. "He said people like me don't belong here. He demanded my wallet and threatened to hurt Max if I didn't give it to him. When Max tried to protect me, he followed through on his threat." Her voice faltered momentarily, but the officer's steady gaze encouraged her to continue. "You did the right thing calling us," he assured her. "We're going to find him, and when we do, he'll face the consequences." Nia nodded, her fists clenching at her sides. "Good," she said, her voice hard with conviction, "because I'm not letting this go." The officer closed his notepad, offering her a firm nod before stepping away to relay her statement over the radio. Nia stood frozen for a moment, her gaze locked on the van as it pulled away. The weight of the night pressed heavily on her shoulders, but her resolve burned brighter than ever. Hours later, when she returned home, the silence of her apartment was deafening. The absence of Max filled the space with an unbearable emptiness. She stood in the doorway, staring at the spot where his bed lay undisturbed. The leash dangled from her hand, a cruel reminder of the events that had unfolded. Each memory replayed in her mind. The sound of Max's whimpers, the pain in his eyes, tightening the knot in her chest. The officers had promised her justice. They had assured her that Jared would be found and held accountable. But for now, all she could do was wait and hope. Justice lingered as a distant promise. Yet, as the hours stretched into the early morning, unease gnawed relentlessly at Naya. Pacing the living room, her steps soft against the carpet, she found herself spiraling into frustration. Sitting idly wasn't enough. Not after what Jared had done, not when Max's suffering replayed in her mind. Her gaze fell once more on the leash resting on the coffee table, its durable fabric embroidered with Max's name. She reached for it, tracing the stitched letters with her fingers as her jaw tightened, determination flaring in her chest. Max had always been there for her. Her guardian, her rock, her constant in life's chaos. Now, it was her turn to step up, to make sure the man who had hurt him didn't get away with it. With renewed resolve, she settled on the edge of the couch, gripping her phone tightly. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb pausing over a name she hadn't called in years. The police had their procedures, but Naya needed someone who operated outside the lines, someone who got results. Her thumb hovered briefly before she pressed the name, the dial tone ringing like a battle drum in her ears. The line clicked, and a deep, familiar voice answered. "Hey," James said, his tone calm but alert. "What's going on, Nia?" "It's late." "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within her. "But I need your help." A brief silence followed, and when he spoke again, his tone had grown cautious. "What kind of help?" "It's about Max," Nia said, her words tumbling out in a torrent. "A man attacked us. He hurt Max. Badly. The police are searching for him, but it's not enough. I need to find him, James. I need him to pay." James sighed, a heavy sound laden with concern. "Nia, this sounds serious. Are you sure you want to go down this road?" "I've never been more sure," she said, her voice sharpening with conviction. "He can't walk away from this. He needs to know he picked the wrong person." Another pause hung between them before James replied, his tone shifting to match her resolve. "All right, tell me everything. I'll help." The weight in Nia's chest lightened slightly, and her grip on the phone relaxed as she recounted the harrowing events of the night. By the time she finished, the fire within her burned brighter. This wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up for Max, for herself, and ensuring that justice, unconventional as it may be, was served. The cafe was quiet, its usual hum of conversation and clinking mugs replaced by a hushed stillness. Nia sat in a corner booth, her hands gripping a mug of untouched coffee. The steam curled lazily into the air, unnoticed as her mind raced through the possibilities of what lay ahead. The emptiness left by Max's absence pressed down on her, fueling the simmering anger beneath her skin. Every time the door swung open, she snapped her head toward it, hope and tension intertwining. Finally, James entered. His presence was as commanding as ever, tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet intensity that seemed to fill the room. Dressed in a leather jacket over a simple black shirt, his demeanor carried the weight of someone who had faced the unthinkable and lived to tell the tale. A former Special Forces operative, James rarely spoke about his past, but his sharp eyes and measured movements told stories of their own. He spotted Nia immediately and made his way to her table with purpose. Sliding into the seat across from her, his gaze swept over her face. "You look like you've been through hell," he remarked, his voice low and steady. "It feels like it," Nia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thanks for coming." "Of course," he replied. "What's going on?" She hesitated, her hands tightening around the mug. "It's Max," she began, her voice breaking slightly. "A man attacked us, hurt him badly. The police are doing what they can, but it's not enough. I need your help." James studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes narrowing. "You're asking me to track someone down?" "Yes," Nia said without hesitation. "I can't just sit back and wait while he gets away." James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You know what you're asking me, right? This isn't just about finding someone. Once you do, you'll have to decide what happens next. Are you ready for that? Do you know who this guy is? What he's capable of?" "I know enough," she answered sharply. "He's dangerous. He threatened me, hurt Max, and then ran like a coward. He can't be allowed to get away with it. James nodded grimly. All right, tell me everything. Don't leave anything out. Nia recounted the story again, her voice steady despite the tremor of anger lacing her words. She described Jared's taunts, the threats, and how Max had tried to defend her, only to be brutally struck down. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling with barely contained rage. He didn't just hurt Max, she said, her voice tight with emotion. He wanted to hurt me too. Max was just in his way. James's jaw tightened, his expression darkening as he processed her words. And the police? What are they doing? They're trying, Nia admitted, frustration creeping into her tone. But you know how these things go. They're overworked, and Jared could disappear before they catch him. I need to know he won't get the chance. James leaned forward, his sharp mind already piecing together the puzzle. Did he say anything that might give us a lead? Something about where he might be? Nia nodded, her brow furrowing as she recalled Jared's bitter rant. He was furious, talking about people like me taking over his neighborhood. He seemed like someone who thinks the world owes him something. He's bitter, angry, and full of blame. James tilted his head, his mind clearly working through the details. Sounds like a guy with a chip on his shoulder. If that's the case, he's probably sticking close to places he knows. Guys like him don't stray far. Can you help me? Nia asked, her voice soft but resolute. You have the skills to find him. James's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. Special Forces wasn't exactly about chasing petty thugs, he said dryly. James fixed her with a steady gaze, his tone measured but firm. Trust me, we cover more ground this way. Just keep your distance and call if anything feels off. Nia nodded reluctantly, the leash clutched tightly in her hand like a lifeline. Got it, she replied, her voice low but resolute. The industrial district loomed around them like a desolate graveyard of abandoned ambitions. Rusted metal doors hung askew on their frames. Graffiti scrawled across crumbling walls whispered tales of neglect and decay. The air was thick with the smell of oil and mildew, and the sound of distant machinery hummed faintly in the background. Nia's footsteps echoed against the uneven pavement as she moved cautiously, her senses on high alert. Each step felt heavier than the last as she approached the first building, her heart pounding in her chest. Shadows stretched long and foreboding, her own silhouette flickering in and out of existence as she moved past broken windows and boarded-up entrances. Her grip on Max's leash tightened further as she drew in a steadying breath, forcing her nerves to settle. This wasn't just about her, or even about Max anymore. It was about standing up to the cruelty Jared represented, about ensuring he didn't do to someone else what he had done to them. James disappeared into the shadows, his movements confident and assured. Nia watched him for a moment before turning her attention to her surroundings. The stillness of the district was oppressive, each creak of old wood or clatter of a loose metal panel setting her teeth on edge. She reached for her phone, keeping it at the ready as she approached a cluster of broken-down vehicles near one of the larger warehouses. The faint sound of voices drifted through the air, stopping Nia in her tracks. She crouched low, pressing herself against the cold metal of a nearby truck, straining to hear. Jared's voice cut through the silence, unmistakable in its sneering tone. "I told you, Mike," he said, his words carrying an edge of arrogance. "This place is perfect. Nobody's gonna find me here." Mike's reply was quieter, harder to make out, but the irritation in his tone was evident. Nia's jaw clenched as she eased closer, her pulse racing. This was it. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling as she typed out a quick message to James. Found him, behind the big warehouse. She stayed low, her breath shallow as she waited. Every second felt like an eternity. Jared's laugh echoed across the lot, sending a chill down her spine. "Let them look," he scoffed. "They won't find me, and even if they do, I'll make sure they regret it." Nia's grip on Max's leash tightened until her knuckles turned white. The leash, once a symbol of comfort and routine, now felt like a reminder of everything Jared had taken from them. Her body tensed as the sound of approaching footsteps signaled James's arrival. He appeared beside her like a shadow, his expression sharp and focused. "Good work," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Stay here. Let me handle this." "No," Nia said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her. "I need to do this. For Max." James hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he searched her face. Finally, he gave a small nod. "Stay behind me. Don't engage, unless you have to." Together they moved toward the voices, their footsteps nearly silent against the cracked asphalt. Jared came into view first, pacing restlessly near a pile of rusted machinery. His hoodie was pulled tight around him, his hands stuffed into the pockets as he talked animatedly to Mike. James stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Jared." Jared spun around, his expression shifting from surprise to anger in an instant. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his posture defensive. "A friend," James replied coolly, "of the woman and the dog you hurt. Remember them?" Jared's sneer returned, but it wavered as James took another step closer. "So what?" he snapped. "You think you can scare me? You've got nothing." James's demeanor remained calm, but there was steel in his tone as he replied, "I've got plenty, starting with the police, who'll be here any minute." Jared's bravado faltered, his eyes darting nervously to Mike, who had already taken a step back. "You're bluffing," Jared said, though his voice had lost some of its edge. Nia stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "He's not bluffing. You thought you could get away with what you did to Max? You thought we'd just let it go?" Jared's gaze snapped to her, and for a moment, something like fear flickered in his eyes. "Look, it wasn't personal," he said, his tone shifting to one of false calm. "I just needed the money." "It was personal when you hurt Max," Nia shot back, her voice rising with each word. "And now you're going to answer for it." Jared opened his mouth to reply, but the distant sound of sirens silenced him. His eyes widened as he realized his time had run out. Without warning, he bolted toward the nearest alley, his movements frantic. James reacted instantly, sprinting after him with precision and speed. Nia followed, her determination overriding her fear. She watched as James tackled Jared to the ground, pinning him with practiced ease. The police arrived moments later, their flashing lights illuminating the scene. Officers poured out of their vehicles, taking Jared into custody as he shouted protests and excuses. Nia stood off to the side, her chest heaving with a mix of relief and exhaustion. As Jared was loaded into the back of a patrol car, one of the officers approached her. "You did good," he said, tipping his hat. "He won't be hurting anyone else." Nia nodded, her gaze shifting to James, who gave her a small, approving smile. For the first time since that terrible day in the park, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Jared's gaze darted toward the door, a flicker of desperation crossing his face. Nia noticed the subtle shift, her body tensing as if bracing for his next move. James stood firm between them, his presence unyielding. "You're not going anywhere," James said, his voice low and sharp. "This ends now." Jared smirked, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "You think you can stop me?" he scoffed, his tone tinged with bravado. "I don't answer to you, or anyone else." Nia stepped forward, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. "You'll answer for what you did to Max," she said, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "You thought you could hurt us and just walk away? Think again." Jared's sneer deepened as he pushed himself up from the mattress, swaying slightly as he stood. "You're all the same," he muttered, his words dripping with disdain, "acting like you're better than everyone else. Your mutt was just a dog, a stupid, worthless dog." The words sliced through Nia like a blade, and she felt her composure cracking. James placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "Don't let him get to you," he said quietly. "He wants you to lose control." Nia nodded, swallowing hard as she forced herself to take a step back. James shifted his focus back to Jared, his gaze hard as steel. "You're done," he said simply. "The cops are already on their way. You can make this easy or—" Jared lunged. The movement was sudden, explosive, and instinctual. Jared's body collided with James's, and they struggled briefly, their movements a blur of raw energy. Nia froze for a split second before instinct kicked in. She grabbed the nearest object, a rusted metal pipe from the cluttered corner of the unit, and raised it, her hands trembling but determined. "Get off him!" she yelled, her voice echoing through the cramped space. Jared turned, his eyes wild, and in that moment, Nia swung the pipe. It wasn't a strong hit, it barely grazed his arm, but it was enough to disrupt his momentum. James took the opening, twisting Jared's arm behind his back and forcing him to the ground with practiced precision. "You're under citizen's arrest," James growled, his tone laced with authority. "Try anything else, and it'll only get worse for you." Jared cursed, thrashing against James's grip, but it was futile. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension, growing louder with each passing second. Nia stepped back, her chest heaving as the reality of the moment settled over her. The flashing red and blue lights of police cars illuminated the entrance to the storage unit. Officers poured in, their commands sharp and decisive as they took control of the situation. Within moments, Jared was in handcuffs, his defiance replaced by a sullen silence as he was led outside. Nia stood frozen, her hands still gripping the pipe. James turned to her, his expression softening as he gently took the makeshift weapon from her hands. "It's over," he said quietly. "You did good." Her knees buckled slightly, and she leaned against the door frame for support. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation began to ebb, leaving behind a heavy, aching exhaustion. "Max," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "I did this for Max." James nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And he'd be proud of you." As the officers secured the scene, one approached Nia, his demeanor calm but professional. "We'll need your statement," he said. "But first, are you okay?" Nia nodded, though her voice was shaky as she replied, "I'm fine. Just glad it's over." The officer offered a small nod of understanding. "You did the right thing. We'll make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." Nia watched as Jared was loaded into the back of a patrol car, his head bowed and his shoulders slumped. The sight brought no satisfaction, only a hollow sense of relief. Justice had been served, but it came at a cost she hadn't anticipated. As the police began to clear the scene, James guided her back to his car. The ride home was quiet, the weight of the night pressing heavily on them both. When they arrived at her apartment, Nia paused in the doorway, her gaze lingering on Max's empty bed. "You okay?" James asked gently, his voice breaking through the silence. Nia nodded, though her chest ached with the absence of her loyal companion. "I will be," she said softly. "I just need time." James hesitated before placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "And Max, he'd want you to keep going." Tears welled in her eyes as she managed a faint smile. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." James nodded, stepping back toward his car. "Call me if you need anything," he said. "Anything at all." As he drove away, Nia stood in the doorway, the first rays of morning light breaking over the horizon. She drew in a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs as she resolved to honor Max's memory by moving forward. Justice had been served, but her journey was far from over. Jared's defiance faltered under the harsh glare of the flashing red and blue lights, his bravado crumbling as two officers advanced into the room. Nia took a step back, her breath heavy, her chest heaving, as the adrenaline coursed through her veins began to ebb. James, calm and composed despite the chaos, released Jared, raising his hands in a show of compliance. "This is the man you're looking for," James said, his voice even but resolute. "Jared Owens! He assaulted her," he gestured toward Nia. "And her dog. He's the one who's been running." Jared stumbled forward, clutching his side, his face a mix of desperation and fury. "They attacked me," he shouted, his voice cracking as he gestured wildly. "This is all a setup. I didn't do anything." The lead officer, a middle-aged man with sharp, appraising eyes, barely blinked at Jared's outburst. "You want to save that for the station," he said dryly, "or should I start listing the charges now?" Nia stood frozen as the scene unfolded before her, her hands trembling at her sides. The weight of the night pressed heavily on her, but she refused to let her fear or exhaustion overpower her resolve. "He hurt Max," she said, her voice breaking but clear. "He kicked him so hard he didn't even care." The officer's gaze softened slightly as he turned to her. "We'll take it from here," he said firmly. "You've done more than enough." As Jared was hauled to his feet, his protests growing more incoherent, James stepped closer to Nia. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice grounding her in the midst of the turmoil. She nodded, though her body still trembled. I couldn't let him get away with it." "You didn't," James replied, his tone steady. "And now, it's over." Jared was led out of the storage unit in handcuffs, his head hanging low as the officers guided him to the waiting patrol cars. Nia watched as he disappeared into the back seat, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, anger, and a lingering ache for Max. One of the officers approached her, his notepad in hand. "Ma'am, we're going to need a full statement. Can you tell us exactly what happened?" Nia hesitated, glancing at James, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Take your time," he said. "I'll be right here." With a deep breath, she began to recount the events, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier as she spoke. She described Jared's threats, his attack on Max, and the way he had taunted her throughout the ordeal. Each word felt like a weight lifted, a step closer to justice, not just for herself, but for the loyal companion who had stood by her through it all. When she finished, the officer closed his notepad with a firm nod. "We'll make sure this gets handled," he assured her, "and we'll follow up with you about the case." "Thank you," Nia said softly, her hands still clutching Max's leash. James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did good," he said simply. As the officers began clearing the scene, Nia allowed herself a moment to breathe. The night's chaos had left her drained, but a quiet strength remained within her, a resolve that Jared's cruelty hadn't broken. She turned to James, her voice quieter now. "Do you think Max will be okay?" James's expression softened. "He's tougher than he looks," he said, "and he's got you in his corner." Her lips curved into a small, grateful smile as she nodded. "Yeah," she murmured, "we've got each other." The storage unit fell silent as the last patrol car pulled away, leaving Nia and James standing in the faint glow of the streetlights. The city's noise began to seep back into the air, a stark reminder that life moved on even after the darkest moments. For Nia, however, this wasn't just about moving forward. It was about healing, about reclaiming the peace Jared had tried to steal. And as she clutched Max's leash tightly in her hand, she knew one thing for certain: justice had been served. But her story, and Max's, was far from over. Nia stepped forward, her voice firm despite the emotional storm raging inside her. "He kicked my dog twice," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "He threatened me, stole from me, and ran when the police arrived. He deserves everything that's coming to him." The officer standing before her gave a slow nod, his hardened expression softening slightly. "We'll take your statement, ma'am. You did the right thing calling us." Nearby, a second officer approached Jared, pulling handcuffs from his belt with a practiced motion. The defiance on Jared's face cracked as the cuffs clicked into place around his wrists. "You're making a mistake," Jared spat, his voice rising in desperation. "This isn't over." The officer tightened the cuffs, his tone cold and unyielding. "It is over. You're under arrest for assault, theft, and animal cruelty. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." Jared's protest dissolved into incoherent mutterings as he was hauled toward the exit. Nia's gaze followed him, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't flinch as Jared's eyes met hers through the window of the squad car. This time, she didn't feel fear, only resolve. She held his gaze with an unyielding intensity until the car door slammed shut, cutting off his view. Another officer approached her, a small notepad in hand. "Ma'am," he began, his voice level, "we'll need you to come to the station and provide a full statement. Can you do that?" "Yes," Nia said firmly, brushing her hands against her jeans as if shaking off the weight of the night. Her voice didn't waver. It was steady, a reflection of her unshakable determination. "I want to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." James stepped to her side, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "We'll go together," he said quietly. "You're not doing this alone." The officer nodded approvingly. "Good. We'll also need the medical records for your dog to complete the report. Animal Services will coordinate with us." At the mention of Max, a lump formed in Nia's throat, but she swallowed it down, nodding quickly. "I'll get everything you need." As they stepped outside, the weight of the night pressed heavily upon her. The storage unit now a fading backdrop to a night she would never forget. Seeing Jared shoved into the back of the squad car brought a flicker of satisfaction, but it wasn't enough. Nia knew this was just the beginning. James turned to her as the cars pulled away, his voice steady. "You did it, Nia. He's in custody. This is just the start," she replied, her jaw tightening with conviction. "He needs to face real consequences for Max and for everyone else he's hurt." James nodded, his expression resolute. "Then we'll see it through, every step of the way." The two stood in the stillness of the aftermath, the flashing lights now a distant memory. Nia clenched her fists, the fire in her chest no longer chaotic, but focused, a clear, unrelenting purpose. Jared had believed he was untouchable, but he was about to learn just how wrong he had been. The early hours of dawn stretched across the sky as James drove silently through the quiet city streets. Nia sat in the passenger seat, her fingers gripping Max's leash tightly. The familiar texture grounded her amidst the flood of memories from the night. The confrontation, Jared's taunts, and Max's pained cries replaying endlessly in her mind. When James pulled up to the animal hospital, he glanced at her with quiet understanding. "Take your time," he said gently. "I'll be right here." Nia nodded, her throat tight, and stepped inside. The fluorescent lights and sterile smell wrapped around her like a cold blanket. The receptionist offered her a kind smile. "He's resting in room 3, she said softly. "Dr. Patel is waiting for you." "Thank you," Nia murmured, her voice barely audible. She moved down the hallway, her steps heavy with anticipation. The door to room 3 loomed ahead, and she hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. Her breath caught at the sight of Max. He lay on a padded bed, his golden fur dulled and his side wrapped in pristine white bandages. He looked smaller somehow, but when his eyes met hers, his tail wagged weakly, a faint but unmistakable sign of life. "Max," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes as she hurried to his side. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she stroked his fur. "Hey, buddy, I'm here." Max let out a soft whine, nudging his head against her hand. The connection between them was immediate, like a bridge over the pain of the night. For the first time in hours, Nia felt the tension in her chest ease, if only slightly. "You're so strong," she murmured, leaning down to press her forehead against his. "You've always been my brave boy." Dr. Patel entered quietly, her gentle demeanor radiating calm. "He's stable and doing well, considering everything he's been through," she said. "The bruising on his ribs is severe, but there's no internal damage. With rest, he should make a full recovery." Relief flooded Nia's face as she looked up. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "I was so scared." Dr. Patel offered her a kind smile. "You did everything right. You got him here in time. He's lucky to have you." Nia turned back to Max, her fingers brushing lightly over his bandages. "No," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm the lucky one." Max's tail wagged again, just a little harder this time, and Nia laughed through her tears. "See?" she said, her voice cracking but full of warmth. "Even after everything, you're still my hero." She stayed there for a long time, her hand resting gently on his side as his breathing grew steadier. The world outside the hospital felt distant and unimportant compared to the quiet strength shared between them. Whatever came next, she knew they would face it together. Max's tail wagged faintly, a small but monumental gesture of resilience that brought tears to Nia's eyes. "You're incredible," she whispered, stroking his fur gently. Dr. Patel smiled, her voice calm and reassuring. "Spend as much time as you need with him, but keep his movements minimal. He needs rest." "Thank you," Nia said, her voice brimming with gratitude. She stayed by Max's side for a few more moments, her fingers running soothingly through his fur as she whispered to him. She told him about Jared's arrest, about how he wouldn't hurt anyone else again. Max's eyes seemed to brighten at her words, and she liked to believe he understood. James appeared quietly in the doorway, his presence steady and grounding. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low. Nia nodded, wiping her eyes before pressing a soft kiss to Max's head. "I'll be back soon," she promised. You just focus on getting better, okay? Max gave her hand a gentle lick, his warmth flooding her with reassurance. It was all she needed to gather her strength. As she stood, a renewed sense of determination settled over her. Jared might have hurt Max, but he hadn't broken him. Now, it was her turn to ensure Jared faced the consequences of his actions. As Nia climbed back into James's car, she exhaled slowly, gripping Max's leash tightly in her hands. James started the engine and glanced at her. "How's he doing?" "He's going to be okay," Nia said, her voice resolute. "He's stronger than I could have imagined." James nodded as he pulled onto the road. "Good. Now let's make sure Jared doesn't have any way out of this." Nia tightened her grip on the leash, the memory of Max's wagging tail fresh in her mind. Let's make sure of it. The city lights streaked past as they drove toward the police station. Nia braced herself for what was to come, the next step in her fight for justice. The station was cold and clinical, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the gray walls and worn linoleum floors. She sat in a hard plastic chair, Max's leash still clutched tightly in her hands, a talisman of his strength and hers. James leaned against the wall nearby, his sharp gaze scanning the room as though always assessing. An officer approached, clipboard in hand, and expression professional yet kind. "Ms. Carter, we're ready for your statement now." Nia stood, her jaw tightening as she nodded. "I'm ready." The officer led her down a narrow hallway to a small, unadorned interview room. A clock ticked softly above the door, and a recording device blinked faintly in the center of the table. "This is just standard procedure," the officer explained, gesturing for her to take a seat. "We'll go through everything, step by step." Nia sat down, folding her hands in her lap to steady herself. "I want to make sure he doesn't get away with this," she said firmly. "I'll tell you everything." The officer nodded and activated the recorder. "Let's start from the beginning. Walk me through what happened in the park." Nia took a deep breath and began recounting the events, her voice unwavering despite the emotional weight of the memories. She described Jared's taunts, the way he had cornered her and threatened Max, and how Max had bravely tried to protect her despite being brutally kicked down. Her hands clenched into fists as she spoke, her determination solidifying with every word. The officer listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When the police arrived at the storage unit, he prompted, "Can you describe what happened there?" "James and I confronted Jared," Nia said, her tone steady but laced with emotion. "He tried to fight back, but we stopped him. Even then, he said things, hateful, vile things. He showed no remorse, not for what he did to Max or to me." The officer's pen paused briefly, and his gaze met hers. "You're willing to testify to all of this in court?" "Yes," Nia said without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he's held accountable." The officer nodded, his expression softening slightly. "You're doing the right thing, Ms. Carter. With the evidence you've provided and your testimony, we have a strong case against him. He'll face charges for assault, theft, and animal cruelty." Nia's shoulders relaxed slightly, though the weight of the ordeal still lingered heavily on her. "How long until it goes to trial?" she asked. "That depends," the officer admitted. "The legal process can take time, but with charges like these, it should move fairly quickly. The prosecutor's office will contact you soon." James, still leaning against the doorframe, spoke up. "We'll make sure she's ready." The officer gave an approving nod. "Good, we'll be in touch." As they exited the interview room, the chill of the station seemed to recede slightly. Outside, the hum of the city reminded Nia that life continued, even after nights like this. "Feel better?" James asked, as they stepped into the cool night air. "A little," Nia admitted, her gaze fixed on the leash in her hand. "But it's not over yet. Jared still thinks he can win. I need to see this through." "And you will," James said, his tone resolute. "We'll make sure of it." Nia looked at the leash, the memory of Max's unwavering loyalty renewing her determination. "For Max," she said softly, "for us." As they drove away, the city lights blurred into the distance, but Nia felt a flicker of hope light up inside her. The fight wasn't over, but she wasn't alone. Jared would face justice, and she would be there every step of the way. Ellen slid the folder across the desk toward Nia, her expression serious. "We have your testimony, the police reports, and the veterinary records for Max." Together, They create a compelling picture of Jared Owens's actions and intentions. Nia opened the folder, her stomach tightening as she took in the contents. Photos of Max's injuries stared back at her, accompanied by a detailed report from Dr. Patel. The bruising on his ribs, the swelling, and the struggle to breathe. All of it came rushing back like a tidal wave, stoking a fire of anger she had fought hard to suppress. But a trial isn't just about evidence, Ellen continued, her tone measured. The defense will try to discredit you, portray Jared as a victim of his circumstances, or minimize Max's injuries. We need to be prepared for anything. James, seated beside Nia, leaned forward, his sharp gaze locked on Ellen. "What's the strategy?" he asked. "How do we counter that?" Ellen nodded, flipping through a legal pad filled with notes. "We'll start by establishing a clear timeline. Nia, your testimony will be critical here. You'll detail the events from the park, the theft, the threats, and how Jared escalated to violence. Dr. Patel's testimony will support the severity of Max's injuries. What about his history?" James pressed. "Does Jared have a record?" Ellen's lips pressed into a thin line. "He does. Minor offenses, bar fights, public disturbances, nothing major, but enough to show a pattern of aggressive behavior. We'll use it to demonstrate that his actions weren't a one-time mistake, but a deliberate choice." Nia exhaled deeply, her resolve hardening. "What about the things he said in the storage unit? The comments about people like me?" Ellen's eyes narrowed slightly. "That will be included. It establishes motive. His hostility wasn't random. It was targeted. However, we need to present it carefully to ensure the jury focuses on the facts and not just the emotions." Nia's hands gripped the folder tightly. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steady. "The jury needs to see him for who he really is." Ellen's expression softened. "You're doing more than that, Nia. You're standing up for what's right. That's not an easy thing to do, but it matters." As the meeting progressed, Ellen walked them through the upcoming trial process, from the opening statements to the cross-examinations. The weight of the situation settled over Nia, but James's steady presence by her side anchored her. He asked incisive questions, ensuring they understood every detail of the strategy. When the meeting ended, Ellen offered Nia an encouraging smile. "We'll finalize everything before the trial. You're doing great. Keep that strength." "Thank you," Nia replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She left the office with James, the cool evening air a welcome contrast to the intensity of the discussion. Clutching Max's leash in her hand, she felt her resolve solidify further. "You're ready for this," James said, his voice calm and assured. "Jared doesn't stand a chance." Nia's jaw tightened. "I have to be," she replied. "For Max, for myself, for everyone he thought he could hurt." The courtroom exuded an air of solemnity, its polished wooden benches and high ceilings a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed Nia's life in the days since the attack. She sat at the prosecution's table, her hands resting on Max's leash for strength. James sat in the gallery behind her, his quiet presence a reassuring constant. Ellen stood at the front of the courtroom, her voice clear and commanding as she delivered her opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about accountability. Jared Owens didn't just harm a dog, he attacked trust, safety, and dignity. The evidence will show that his actions were not only reckless, but intentional. We ask you to hold him accountable." Nia studied the jury, searching their faces for signs of understanding or empathy. A few nodded slightly, while others remained unreadable, their focus shifting between Ellen and Jared, who sat stiffly at the defense table. His lawyer, a wiry man with sharp eyes, scribbled notes but gave no indication of his strategy. When it was Nia's turn to testify, her pulse quickened. She stood, walked to the witness stand, and raised her hand to take the oath. Her hand trembled slightly, but she steadied herself as she settled into the chair. Ellen gave her a reassuring nod before speaking. "Ms. Carter," Ellen began, her tone warm but professional, "can you tell the court what happened on the evening of the incident?" Nia recounted the events in vivid detail. Her voice remained steady as she described the peaceful walk with Max, Jared's taunts, his escalating threats, and the moment he had attacked her dog. Her voice faltered only when she spoke of Max's pained yelp, A sound etched deeply in her memory, but she pressed on. "Why didn't you just walk away?" Ellen asked gently. "I tried," Nia replied, her gaze unwavering. "But he blocked my path. He wasn't just threatening me. He wanted to humiliate me, to make me feel like I didn't belong. And when Max tried to protect me, Jared took his anger out on him." Ellen stepped closer. "How has this affected you and Max since that day?" Nia took a deep breath. "Max is healing, but it's been hard. He's always been my protector, my best friend. Seeing him hurt like that, knowing someone could be so cruel, it's something I'll never forget. I'm here today because I want to make sure Jared Owens can't do this to anyone else." Ellen's expression softened, her voice filled with quiet respect. "Thank you, Ms. Carter." Ellen returned to her seat, her expression calm and measured, while Jared's lawyer, Mr. Finch, adjusted his tie before stepping toward the witness stand. His calculated demeanor exuded confidence as he addressed Nia. "Ms. Carter," he began smoothly, his voice tinged with an air of practiced skepticism. "You seem very emotional about this incident. Isn't it possible that you overreacted or misinterpreted Mr. Owens's intentions?" Nia's jaw tightened, but she held her composure, her voice steady as she replied, "No, he made his intentions perfectly clear. He threatened me, and he hurt Max. There was nothing to misinterpret." The corner of Finch's mouth twitched upward in a faint, condescending smirk. "You claim he threatened you," he pressed, "but did he ever physically harm you? And isn't it true that you and your companion escalated the situation by pursuing him later?" James shifted slightly in his seat behind her, but Nia didn't waver. "We didn't escalate anything," she said firmly. "We stood up to him because he thought he could get away with what he did. I wasn't going to let that happen." Finch raised an eyebrow as though he had anticipated her answer. "No further questions, Your Honor," he said, stepping back to his seat. Nia's legs felt like lead as she stepped down from the stand. Her nerves trembled, but her resolve remained unbroken. As she returned to her seat, her gaze locked with James's in the gallery. His small, reassuring nod reignited a flicker of strength within her. The trial was far from over, but she had spoken her truth. Now it was up to the court to decide. The defense wasted no time presenting their case. Finch's polished confidence filled the room as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, gesturing toward Jared, who sat stiffly at the defense table, "this case is not as straightforward as the prosecution would have you believe. My client, Mr. Owens, has been portrayed as a monster, but I urge you to consider a different perspective. Was this truly an act of cruelty, or a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control?" Nia clenched her fists beneath the table, her nails digging into her palms. Finch's words were slick, manipulative, and designed to cast doubt. But she kept her gaze steady, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The defense's first witness was a former co-worker of Jared's, a man in his late 30s with a nervous demeanor. His voice wavered as he spoke. "Jared's always been a little rough around the edges," the man admitted, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "But he's not a bad guy. He's had a tough life, lost his job, his home. Sometimes he gets angry, but who wouldn't?" "Thank you," Finch said smoothly, offering the witness a kind smile. No further questions. Ellen's cross-examination was swift and precise. "You say Mr. Owens gets angry," she began, her tone sharp. "Has he ever directed that anger at you or others?" The witness hesitated, his gaze darting toward Jared. "Not me personally," he said slowly, "but I've seen him lose his temper. A few arguments at work. Nothing serious." "Did these arguments ever escalate to physical violence?" Ellen pressed. The man faltered, his hands fidgeting. "I guess there were a couple of times he got physical," he admitted reluctantly, "but that's not the same as what you're saying happened here." Ellen nodded, her expression neutral but firm. "Thank you for clarifying." The defense called Jared to the stand next. His steps carried an air of defiance, though his stiff movements betrayed the lingering bruises from his confrontation with James. As he settled into the witness chair, he avoided Nia's gaze, his jaw tight. "Mr. Owens," Finch began, his tone sympathetic, "can you tell the court what happened that evening from your perspective?" Jared leaned into the microphone, his voice feigning calm. "I was walking through the park, Minding my business, he began. His hand shot out, pointing toward Nia. She came out of nowhere, yelling at me. Her dog started barking and growling. I panicked. I didn't mean to hurt the dog, but it was aggressive. Finch nodded as though Jared's story made perfect sense. So? You felt threatened? Yeah, Jared said, his voice growing louder, feeding off Finch's support. That dog came at me. I just reacted. Nia's anger flared, but Ellen placed a calming hand on her arm. Let him dig his own hole, she whispered. Did you steal anything from Ms. Carter? Finch continued, his voice as smooth as ever. No, Jared said firmly. I don't even know what she's talking about. She made that up to make me look bad. Finch smiled faintly. No further questions. Ellen rose gracefully from her seat, her movements deliberate as she approached the stand. Mr. Owens, she began, her voice cool and measured. You claim you felt threatened by Max. Did you report this supposedly aggressive dog to anyone? Animal control, perhaps? The police? Jared shifted in his seat, his confidence beginning to falter. No, but... And you said you didn't steal from Ms. Carter, Ellen continued, cutting him off. Then why did she describe you running off with her wallet? That didn't happen, Jared snapped, his voice rising. She's lying. Ellen raised an eyebrow, her expression sharp. And yet, the police recovered her wallet from your storage unit. Care to explain how it got there? Jared's mouth opened and closed, his face reddening as he fumbled for words. I don't know. Maybe she planted it. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, prompting the judge to rap his gavel sharply. Order! Ellen stepped closer, her voice cutting like a knife. So, according to you, Ms. Carter is a liar, her dog is aggressive, and the police evidence is fabricated. Convenient, isn't it? Jared glared at her, but he said nothing. Ellen turned to the jury, her expression calm but pointed. No further questions, Your Honor. As Jared returned to his seat, his earlier bravado was fractured and exposed. Nia felt a flicker of satisfaction. He was unraveling, but the trial wasn't over yet, and the stakes were too high to celebrate early. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with tension. Every seat in the gallery was filled, the soft murmur of spectators barely masking the gravity of the moment. Nia sat at the prosecution's table, her hands resting on Max's leash. She didn't take her eyes off Ellen, who stood confidently before the jury, ready to deliver her closing argument. Ladies and gentlemen, Ellen began her closing argument with a steady, confident voice that resonated through the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her eyes scanning the jury, this case is about responsibility. Jared Owens made a series of deliberate choices on the night in question. He chose to approach Ms. Carter and her dog. He chose to threaten her, harm her dog, and steal from her. These actions were not accidents. They were calculated, malicious, and entirely avoidable. She paced slowly, her gaze firm yet empathetic. The defense would have you believe this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Owens acted out of fear. But let's examine the facts. Ms. Carter's testimony was consistent, detailed, and corroborated by physical evidence. The stolen wallet recovered from the defendant's possession. Dr. Patel's veterinary records confirmed the severity of Max's injuries, which were not the result of a simple misstep, but a deliberate act of cruelty. Ellen stopped and locked eyes with the jury, her voice softening slightly, but still commanding. And then, there are Mr. Owens's own words, his hostility, his lack of remorse, and his refusal to take accountability. This isn't about an overreaction. It's about a pattern of behavior, a pattern that led to this violent act. She gestured toward Nia, her tone resolute but compassionate. Ms. Carter is not here for revenge. She's here for justice. She has shown extraordinary courage and resolve in standing up for herself and her dog, ensuring that someone who thought they could act with impunity is held accountable. I ask you to do the same. Ellen returned to the prosecution's table, her steps deliberate. This is your chance to send a message that actions like Mr. Owens's have consequences. I trust you will do the right thing. Nia's heart swelled with a flicker of hope as Ellen sat down beside her. You were amazing, Nia whispered, her voice barely audible. Ellen gave her a small but reassuring smile. Now we wait. Finch rose from his seat, adjusting his tie as he approached the jury. His tone was smooth, almost conversational. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard a lot of emotional testimony over the past few days, he began, gesturing toward Jared, who sat rigidly at the defense table. While my heart goes out to Ms. Carter and her dog, I urge you to consider the possibility that emotions have clouded this case. He paced slowly, his voice measured and practiced. Mr. Owens has admitted to making mistakes. He's not perfect, but who among us is? The prosecution wants you to believe he's some kind of monster, but the evidence shows otherwise. There's reasonable doubt here. Doubt about his intent, doubt about the events as described by Ms. Carter, and doubt about whether this was truly a crime or an unfortunate misunderstanding. Finch's words were slick, but Nia felt their emptiness. She glanced at the jury, trying to gauge their reactions, but their faces remained neutral, betraying nothing. When Finch returned to his seat, the judge instructed the jury to deliberate. Nia's stomach churned as they filed out of the courtroom, their expressions unreadable. James leaned forward from his seat behind her, his voice low and steady. You did everything you could. Now it's up to them. Nia nodded, gripping Max's leash tightly in her hands. I just want him to pay for what he did, she said softly. The waiting was excruciating. As the courtroom emptied, the air grew heavier with tension. Nia reminded herself that she had done her part. All she could do now was hope. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in. Nia's heart pounded in her chest, her fingers clutching Max's leash so tightly her knuckles turned white. James sat behind her, his steady presence grounding her as the judge called for order. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked, his tone formal and measured. A middle-aged woman in the front row of the jury stood, holding a folded piece of paper. We have, Your Honor. Nia held her breath, her gaze locked on the woman as she unfolded the paper and began to read. In the case of Jared Owens, we find the defendant guilty on all counts: assault, theft, and animal cruelty. A wave of relief crashed over Nia. She exhaled shakily, her grip on Max's leash loosening as her shoulders finally relaxed. Jared, however, erupted from his seat, his face red with fury. This is bull, he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. You're all against me. This isn't justice. The judge's gavel banged sharply. Mr. Owens, sit down, or you will be removed from the courtroom. Jared slumped back into his chair, muttering under his breath. Nia refused to look at him, her focus remaining on the judge as he turned his attention to the sentencing. Mr. Owens, the judge began, his tone stern and unyielding, your actions were deliberate, malicious, and without provocation. You caused physical harm to an innocent animal and instilled fear and trauma in Ms. Carter. Such behavior is unacceptable, and it is the duty of this court to ensure you face the appropriate consequences. The judge paused, his gaze piercing. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison for assault and theft, with an additional 3 years for animal cruelty, to be served consecutively. You will also be required to pay restitution for Ms. Carter's veterinary expenses and any related damages. Jared's face twisted in disbelief. 8 years for a dog, he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. The judge's gavel struck the bench again, his expression unwavering. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom began to clear, Nia remained seated, her emotions a whirlwind of relief, exhaustion, and lingering anger. James leaned forward, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. You did it, he said quietly. It's over. Nia turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For Max, she said softly. He deserved justice. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, cameras flashing as Nia and James emerged. Ellen joined them briefly, her expression professional but warm. You were incredible, Nia, she said. Max would be proud. Nia managed a small smile. He's why I did this, she said, clutching the leash tightly. For him, and for everyone who's ever been told they're powerless. As the reporters pressed closer, their questions blurring into the background, Nia took a deep breath. The fight had been long and grueling, but justice had been served. Then Max's leash was still in her hand, a symbol of strength, love, and the bond that had carried her through. Your courage made this happen, Ellen said, her voice calm and full of admiration. Thank you, Nia replied, her voice steady but full of emotion. I just hope this sends a message. As she walked away from the courthouse and the chaos of the crowd, Max's leash still in her hand, a profound sense of closure settled over her. Jared was behind bars, and while it couldn't undo the harm he had caused, it meant he wouldn't hurt anyone else. For the first time in weeks, Nia allowed herself to breathe deeply. The road to healing would be long, but she knew one thing for certain. She and Max would walk it together. The sun hung low in the sky, casting warm golden hues across the quiet suburban neighborhood as Nia turned into her driveway. The soft orange glow stretched long shadows across the yard. In the passenger seat, Max lounged contentedly, his golden fur shimmering in the fading light. His tail thumped against the seat, a quiet rhythm of excitement. It had been a long journey to this moment. Weeks of vet visits, careful monitoring, and gentle walks to rebuild his strength had finally culminated in the news she'd longed to hear. Max had been cleared to come home that morning. Nia had spent the entire day preparing for him, washing his favorite bed, setting out new toys, and even hanging a small sign on the porch that read, "Welcome home, Max. We're home, buddy," she said softly, reaching over to scratch behind his ears. Her fingers brushed the faint scar along his side, a reminder of the battle they'd endured together. "Ready to see your kingdom?" Max let out a cheerful bark, his bright eyes meeting hers with unbridled trust. As Nia opened the car door, he hopped out carefully, his movements steady but confident. He sniffed the air, taking in the familiar sense of home, before trotting toward the porch. The sight brought tears to Nia's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. The trial, the sleepless nights, the overwhelming worry. It had all been worth it to see Max like this, happy, healthy, and whole again. Jared was behind bars where he belonged, and the weight of those dark weeks was finally lifting. She picked up Max's leash out of habit, letting it dangle loosely in her hand as he began exploring the yard. "Go ahead," she encouraged with a smile, waving him toward the grass. "You're free." Max bounded forward, sniffing every corner of the yard before flopping onto his back in the grass, his legs kicking playfully in the air. Nia laughed, sitting on the porch steps to watch him. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt at peace. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from the moment. It was a text from James. "How's the big guy settling in?" She smiled as she typed back, "He's perfect. The yard is officially Max's again." James's reply came almost instantly. "Good. Don't forget, I owe him a steak dinner for being the bravest dog I know. Let me know when he's ready to cash in." Nia chuckled, tucking her phone away as she turned her attention back to Max. He was chasing a butterfly across the yard, his movements lighter and more joyful than they had been in weeks. It was such a small thing, yet it meant the world to her, a reminder that life could be beautiful, even after the darkest storms. "Max!" she called. He bounded over, his tongue lolling happily. She wrapped her arms around him as he sat beside her, burying her face in his fur. "We did it, buddy. He can't hurt us anymore." Max wagged his tail furiously, giving her an enthusiastic lick on the cheek. She laughed, wiping her face. Okay, I get it. Let's go inside. You've got a surprise waiting for you." As they stepped into the house, Max's tail wagged even harder. His favorite bed sat in its usual spot, freshly cleaned, along with a small pile of new toys. A box of treats waited on the counter, ready to celebrate his return. Nia smiled, her heart full as she watched Max trot around, inspecting every corner of his home as though seeing it for the first time. The future wasn't certain, but one thing was, she and Max would face it together, stronger and closer than ever. And for now, that was more than enough. Thank you for watching this story. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on the next one. In the meantime, check out these hand-picked stories we think you'll love. Have a great day.